Hello and welcome to a new episode of our podcast series for 2021 from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askary. Today is Wednesday, October the 6th. Now, as you have noticed from watching our previous podcasts and reading our articles, the purpose of our institute's work is to often tell what the Belt and Road is, its benefits for the international community, but also for Sweden and Europe. But sometimes we have to discuss what the Belt and Road is not. And that means that we have to tackle some of these strange and sometimes bizarre narratives about the Belt and Road Initiative itself and China's policy and intentions behind it. Now, you have all heard about the debt trap narrative, which we have debunked thoroughly. Others have done that. We have documented that, but we will continue because some people continue to going back to the debt trap narrative. But this time we're going to discuss the question of corruption, that whether the Belt and Road fosters corruption in developing nations or not. Now, what provoked me in doing this podcast, although I have dealt with this question before, is an article which was published yesterday in Foreign Affairs. It's called "The Fight Against China's Bribe Machine, the Pitfalls of Conducting US Foreign Policy Through the Courts." And when you read these articles and watch these videos, like this article from Foreign Affairs, which is supposed to be one of the most important foreign policy institutions and think tanks in the world, there is nothing, absolutely nothing connecting the title, which is China's Bribe Machine, to the picture of the Chinese president and the content of the article to any bribery case. If they had mentioned one case of bribery in this article in which Chinese officials, banks, or companies were indicted, I would have appreciated it. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to volunteer to help the Foreign Affairs Institute, the Foreign Affairs and other think tanks in the United States and Europe, and take a very, very well-documented major corruption scandal in a country which is a signatory to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is Malaysia. This is the best documented case. There were indictments. People were found guilty, people were fined, and I'm going to tell you the facts as I discovered them. The story is that Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib Razak, he was found guilty on July 28th, 2020, last year, of 7 accounts of corruption, and bribery, money laundering, and so on and so forth. And he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. This is the biggest scandal in the corruption scandal in the history of Malaysia. Now, Najib Razak has appealed that and is pending the appeal. So he's not in prison yet. Now, Najib Razak is from a very wealthy and powerful political family. He received his education in Britain and, of course, liberal economics. He was obviously very popular in London and in Washington. And President Trump has called him my favorite prime minister. Now, Najib Razak was prime minister from 2009 to 2019. In his time, Malaysia joined the Belt and Road in 2015. And also his government signed a number of very important mega infrastructure projects like the East Coast Rail Link, which is a $16 billion railway project, very important one. And also a major gas pipeline project called the Trans-Sabah gas pipeline. Now, these were part of cooperation with China. There were also massive Chinese investments in Malaysia during these years. Now, suspicion about Najib Razak's corruption was there already in 2015 but he, as prime minister, and his friends in the government suppressed the investigation. But in May 2018, Najib Razak lost the elections to former prime minister and great popular statesman of Malaysia, Dr. Mahathir bin Mohamad. As soon as Mahathir Mohamad and his government came into power, they launched the investigation. And at the same time, Prime Minister Mahathir bin Mohamad suspended all the infrastructure projects which were signed with China. Now, when that happened, all the Western think tanks and mass media said, oh, we got them. Now we have the proof. But don't be in a hurry. I'm coming to the facts of this. Anyway, so at the time, I was looking at this case, which I consider a very, very serious case. I wrote a very long article. I will link to you about this. And I did a search at the time of the terms China, Belt and Road, Malaysia, corruption on Google. So I got very interesting results. The first results, the first top 10 were from American think tanks and major mainstream media. And the results you got at the time, there were hundreds. None of them were Malaysian sources, by the way, only American and European media and think tanks. The first one is the Belt and Road Initiative is a corruption bonanza, Foreign Policy magazine. The other one is called Corruption Flows Along China's Belt and Road, Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, CSIS. This is also one of the very respected think tanks. The other one is called How China's Belt and Road Became a Global Trail of Trouble, Forbes magazine. The fourth one says, a Malaysian corruption scandal shows the dark side of China's Belt and Road Initiative, the Washington Post. And lastly, one is called Below the Belt and Road, Corruption and Illicit Dealings in China's Global Infrastructure by the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Now, there are many, many other such articles. So I read all these articles. Actually, I spent a lot of time doing that because facts and truth is important for me. And I will be held, myself will be held accountable if I write things that are not correct or say things that are not, can be proven with facts. No, in these articles, there is no connection at all between the scandal in Malaysia and China and the Belt and Road projects. They just are put next to each other. So I did my own investigation. I went to the Malaysian websites. I went to other sources. I contacted friends in Malaysia who are political, people with political knowledge and economists. So what it turns out is that the whole thing builds around a national sovereign wealth fund created by Najib Razak when he became prime minister. It is called the One Malaysia Development Berhad. Abbreviation is 1MDB. Now, that fund was supposed to raise money for development projects in Malaysia. That did not happen. So in 2017 already, there were around $4.5 billion missing from the fund. Nobody knew where it is. At the same time, $700 million showed up in the private bank accounts of Prime Minister Najib Razak around the world. But since he was prime minister, the investigation was suppressed. So how did this fund was financed? Was it filled with $10 billion? The method which was used is by getting cash through either international bond issuance with the assistance of international banks who would help the Malaysian state to raise money from investors from around the world, mostly from the United States and Europe, to fill the fund. These are loans, of course, that's credit. And or by doing major contracts with international corporations. We will name a few of them. But in return for these loans, Malaysian state-owned assets like ports, power plants, real estate projects, all these things were used as collateral. So in case Malaysia defaults, they will have to sell these assets to the investors. The debt which was incurred this way became public debt of Malaysia. So now the people of Malaysia owe the international community $10 billion. At the same time, some of these international banks helped Najib Razak through very sophisticated money laundering schemes to funnel money from this fund into private bank accounts around the world, amounting to around $600 to $700 million for his private. And the rest of money, most of it disappeared. Now we come to the evidence. So get ready for the first document. From whom? From the US Department of Justice, which conducted an investigation into the same scandal. This is a press release from the US Department of Justice for immediate release on Thursday, October 22, 2020. The headline is fastening of seatbelts. Let's figure out who were the villains in this whole story. Goldman Sachs charged in foreign bribery case and agrees to pay over $2.9 billion. This is from the US Department of Justice. What the US Department of Justice press release says, furthermore, the Goldman Sachs Group incorporated, a global financial institution headquartered in New York, and Goldman Sachs Malaysia, its Malaysian subsidiary, have admitted to conspiring to violate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA, in connection with a scheme to pay over $1 billion in bribes to Malaysian and Abu Dhabi officials to obtain lucrative business for Goldman Sachs, including its role in underwriting approximately $6.5 billion in 3 bond deals for One Malaysia Development Berhad, i.e. 1MDB, for which the bank earned hundreds of millions in fees. Goldman Sachs will pay, I'm continuing to read the press release from the Department of Justice. Goldman Sachs will pay more than $2.9 billion as part of a coordinated resolution with criminal and civil authorities in the United States, the United Kingdom, Singapore, and elsewhere. Goldman Sachs entered into a deferred prosecution agreement with the department in connection with criminal information filed today in the Eastern District of New York, charging the company with conspiracy to violate the anti-bribery provisions of the FCPA. And also in Malaysia, pleaded guilty in the US District Court for the Eastern District, New York, to a 1-count criminal information, charging it with conspiracy to violate the anti-bribery provision of the FCPA. Okay, so Goldman Sachs is not a Chinese bank. It's not part of the Communist Party apparatus. This is an American bank, very, very powerful American bank. Now, let's see who else was involved in this. Let's figure out if there were any Chinese banks, officials, or companies were involved in this. The investigations, both in Malaysia and in many other countries, showed that the other banks involved in this huge money laundering and corruption scandal are, first of all, Britain's Royal Bank of Scotland, American banks JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo, in addition to the main culprit, Goldman Sachs. Germany's Deutsche Bank AG, Switzerland's Credit Suisse, Luxembourg's Edmond de Rothschild Group, Austria's Avestra Asset Management. The last one, the managers were suspended for 10 years and the whole company went bankrupt, was shut down. Now, among these, there are no Chinese banks. There are no Chinese companies. These are all American, British, European, Australian, and other banks. The only investigation which took place in China was in Hong Kong, but it was conducted by Chinese police, Hong Kong police, into the Credit Suisse, the Swiss bank accounts, where they found hundreds of millions of dollars of Najib's money. So Chinese banks, Chinese companies, and Chinese officials had absolutely nothing to do with this corruption and bribery scandal. It was Western banks and institutions. And there was also from the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, two major companies. One of them is an oil company, the other one is a holding company. So what about China? And why did Mahathir bin Mohamad cancel all these or suspended all these infrastructure projects which were signed under the Belt and Road with Malaysia? Now the Chinese, the BRI projects like the East Coast Rail Link and the Trans-Sabah gas pipelines were not financed by this 1MDB fund. These were financed through loans from the Chinese Export-Import Bank. And Chinese and Malaysian joint ventures, that Chinese companies went together in joint ventures with Malaysian companies to finance port projects, manufacturing of steel, solar power, textile, electronics, and electrical products. They also built an industrial park and they had major real estate construction and energy construction projects. But all these were financed, foreign direct investment by Chinese companies or joint ventures by Malaysian, and none of them had anything to do with this fund, the 1MDB fund. So why did they cancel these major mega infrastructure banks being built by China? Well, Prime Minister Mahathir bin Mohamad, the new prime minister, he decided to suspend these projects because there was a chaotic situation in Malaysia. The state was almost bankrupt. They had $10 billion in debt, and they have the historical corruption scandal to deal with. And they were not sure if the state is capable of paying back the loans for these projects. So therefore, they decided to suspend the projects and clean up the sheet, figure out the culprits, and then reorganize the finances, and then relaunch the projects. Prime Minister Mahathir bin Mohamad went to China immediately at that year. He met with the President Xi Jinping, and then he had a very long meeting with Prime Minister Li Keqiang, after which they signed a number of agreements. Prime Minister, after his meeting with the Li Keqiang, he said he stayed in China 5 days. And Mahathir said that this scandal is not about the Chinese, okay? He said, quote, "We are here to assure the Chinese government and its people that there will be no change of policy. We see China as a model for development." End of quote. Now, did anybody in these think tanks and who were celebrating that finally they found the Chinese culprits, did they report what Prime Minister Mahathir said? No. Mahathir emphasized the issue is the corruption inside the Malaysian government itself. And until that is adjudicated, Malaysia had no choice but to put the projects on hold and to renegotiate the projects if they are to be reinstated. Now, the joint communique between the Malaysian and Chinese side at the end of Mahathir's visit stated that the two sides will speed up the implementation of the Memorandum of Understanding on promoting mutual economic development through the Belt and Road Initiative, the original Memorandum of Understanding. So anyway, what happened with the East Coast Rail Link is that it was slimmed down from $16 to $13 billion, and Malaysian companies were brought in as partners in the project so they could work on building part of the project. So the project was made a bit smaller, but then it started the construction. Many other projects were relaunched because most of them were in Chinese investments. Malaysia doesn't have to pay anything. And because of the Corona crisis, the construction work stopped and then was resumed. So all these problems had nothing to do with China, had nothing to do with the Belt and Road Initiative, and they were resolved in a friendly way. What we discover, like in the debt trap narrative, it was Western banks, Western interests who were the culprits. Whatever the reason is, what we can find from these is that there is no truth. There's not a shred of fact supporting these allegations. And I think what this story itself is very, very important case study for students, for researchers, and for journalists, especially young people, because you should not buy a story just because it's published in a very, very well-respected think tank or media outlet. Don't stop at the headline. Don't stop at looking at the picture of the Chinese president. Read the whole article or the report, even if it's many, many pages. Try to figure out where the facts are. If there is a fallacy of composition, if there is guilt by association, all these things, you have to work as a detective to be able to figure out if there is any truth to whatever is being said. Stop spreading narratives. Let's work on real intellectual fact-finding and presenting ideas and initiatives which are in the benefit of everybody and every nation. So I stop here, and I hope to see you in new podcasts.